So the top 10 best horror films of the 90s. This is going to be my list, not your list. So let me know what your favorite film in the decade of the 90s is that's based on horror, or if you just want to tell me your favorite film in the 90s that's not horror, that's fine too. But we're going to kick this thing off starting with number 10, which is going to be Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I will admit I'm not the biggest fan of Nightmare on Elm Street. Out of the big three, it's my least favorite of the three. The only films I actually really like are the first three and then New Nightmare. And that's kind of it. Every other film to me is either boring or uninteresting or not good. And so New Nightmare, what I love about this movie is that it does something different. It takes the quintessential nightmare formula that we've known for 6, 7 movies now, and it just throws it completely out the window, and it does something different. This film was a big test to see how an audience would be able to handle fourth wall breaking and really doing something within kind of a meta scope. This movie decides to make Heather Langenkamp the focus. Just like the first movie, however, it's a little different. Heather Langenkamp herself is playing a version of herself in this movie. And I think that that's really fascinating, where the movie understands that Freddy was something from the movies. It was something from Hollywood. It wasn't real. And Freddy is trying to get into the real world. It's really groundbreaking in that way. And again, it really helped introduce this idea of meta. So that way, films that come along later on, like Scream, would be able to be successful where people could understand what is actually happening within the context of the world. And this movie's really funny. There's incredible stuff with Freddy in the third act. I do think that this is the scariest movie that Freddy's been since the first film, the original. This movie does have its faults. It suffers a little bit with pacing. It does have some pacing issues. There's some moments in here that don't work for me. The movie kind of comes to a lull in the middle, directly in the middle of the film. But the third act is really satisfying, and it's got some really great scares and some really cool kills. And I really like New Nightmare. It's very different from the other films. It's not really like a entire dream sequence type of thing where people just die left and right. There's a lot of build up to eventually what happens in the third act. Number 9 is going to be a film that really plays on my fears. It's probably not going to be on your top 10 list. I don't know if this movie really is a favorite by a lot of people, but it's going to be Arachnophobia. I have a huge fear of spiders. Anybody who knows me knows that myself, my wife, we both hate spiders. I usually have to deal with them because my wife is way more scared of spiders than I am, but Arachnophobia really kind of got under my skin because it played on my biggest fear, which is the creepy crawlers on 8 legs. This movie does have some fun moments. It feels like a Spielberg type horror film. Like, there's certain moments that are really endearing and heartwarming. There's some good humor in this movie. And then there's some moments where it feels very much like super climactic for the sake of being climactic. I love Jeff Daniels in this film. It's really nice to see him in this movie. I like some of the ways that the spiders kind of intrude this small community. I think that that's pretty awesome. The way that the barn looks with all these spiders is really creepy, but it's really aesthetically pleasing. This movie doesn't always work. There are some problems with the film. I do think that sometimes the film takes itself too seriously, and also the logic of these kind of small, like, yeah, they're bigger spiders, but they're still small in scale. Like, that they do all this, like, irreparable damage is just kind of weird to me. But Arachnophobia has to make this list because it plays on my biggest fear. Coming in at number 8 is going to be Child's Play 2. This is the best Chucky movie. I don't care what anybody says. In my opinion, this is the best Child's Play / Chucky movie. This is everything you want. This is the fun of Child's Play, which you should have fun with this concept of Chucky. There's some really scary moments with Chucky in this movie. They go back to the toy factory, which is awesome. Kyle is a great final girl who's helping Andy throughout the entire experience. And so it's like, this is a movie that was like made for me. I'm not a huge Child's Play guy, just like Nightmare. I would actually say less so more with Child's Play. There's not a lot of movies that I like in this franchise. It's really this one, I guess the original, and Bride of Chucky. And I also don't mind the reboot. But every other Child's Play movie to me has just kind of been really not good. But Child's Play 2 strips it down to its basic core, which is Chucky is menacing. He's scary. There's some good effective kills in this movie. I think one of the most iconic scenes is the scene where he's in the closet at school. It's really cool, and I love that whole sequence. So Child's Play 2, I love it. Coming in at number 7 is going to be The Exorcist 3. This is the best Exorcist movie since the original, and now after having seen Exorcist Believer last night, I can say with affirmity that this is the only good Exorcist sequel in this entire franchise. Look, this movie is different because it's about a detective who is basically trying to figure out a string of murders that's happening. And so he goes to a prison and talks to a bunch of different inmates. And the way that things kind of transpire in this movie is very awesome because this movie was directed by William Peter Blatty, who was the guy who wrote not just the original Exorcist film, but he also wrote the book that the movie was inspired by. And he directed the hell out of this movie. This movie is great. It has probably the best jump scare of all time. It has an incredible sequence with Brad Dourif that if you watch it, I mean, you're going to remember it forever. There's an incredible scary sequence in a confessional. I love this movie. It is the best Exorcist sequel, and I'm happy that this movie was really able to captivate me and really kind of capture the essence of the first movie without trying to be a rehash of what that movie did so well. Coming in at number 6 is going to be The Nightmare Before Christmas. I know that not a lot of people are going to put this on their list. They don't look at it as a horror movie. I've talked about this movie a lot. I have a whole video dedicated on my channel somewhere talking about this movie and how this movie actually is a horror film and that it is a Halloween movie, in my opinion. I just love this movie. Anytime I can add it on a list, I'm going to do it because I just think that this movie is downright beautiful to look at. I think the story is very strong. There are some creepy images if you're a child and you're really little and you don't have really any concept of any spooky or scary thing. It might stay with you and it might be pretty scary to the naked eye at first. So I do like Nightmare Before Christmas. It's such a classic. I watch it almost every year, whether it be on Halloween or Christmas, and I just think that you can have such a blast with this film. Coming in at number 5, going to my top 5, is going to be Scream, the original film by Wes Craven. I've always had a weird history with Scream. When I was younger, I remember watching the first 3 movies with a friend of mine. We'd go to our local Video King, which is Blockbuster, not Blockbuster, because we didn't have a Blockbuster. I'm from a small town, and we'd rent a bunch of horror movies every weekend, and it would usually be like Child's Play, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. Freddy vs. Jason was one of the big ones, but we'd also rent Scream. And I never really liked Scream, and maybe it was because at that time in my life, we were watching more serious slashers like Nightmare on Elm Street, like Friday the 13th, like Halloween. So I didn't really understand why this movie felt so unserious at times, and I always kind of thought that was like, maybe it was a way that they were trying to buff up the fun and the funny to really hide the fact that the movie's not truly that scary. But as I got older, I've really come to appreciate why this movie does that, why it really just makes fun of the slasher genre as a whole, because it is kind of an absurd genre of film that I love so much. But I also think that this movie, the original film, is actually very scary compared to the other films in the franchise, because the other films just rehash what this film does so well. This movie is iconic. It has some incredible, memorable lines, some incredible, memorable characters like Stu Macher, who I think is probably the best character in this movie. I love the way he's portrayed in this film by Matthew Lillard. It's awesome. And then I also really love Neve Campbell's Sidney Prescott. I think she's the quintessential final girl, probably one of the top 3 best final girls of all time. And it's really just awesome what this movie has done for not just the slasher genre, but horror as a whole, because you can actually have more fun. It doesn't have to be like this super dark and twisted and demented type of genre all the time, but you can have actually some light at the end of that tunnel. Coming in at number 4 is going to be Silence of the Lambs. This is a movie that you can look at in many different ways. You can look at it as a murder mystery. You can look at it as a detective thriller. You can look at it as a drama. But at its core, it is a horror film. There are some horrifying things in this movie. And the reason why they're horrifying is not because they don't show it. They don't show a lot of the horror in this movie. It is the dialogue. It's the darkness behind Anthony Hopkins' lifeless eyes. This is a movie that really embodies kind of the human experience. There's so much evil in the world, and there's so many things that, like, how can you get into a sadistic, twisted mind, and why do people snap and do what they do? And Anthony Hopkins is so good in this movie. Obviously won an Oscar for his performance in this film. I love the back and forth between him and Jodie Foster. I love the cat and mouse game. I think the entire sequence at the end of this film is so incredibly effective. It's terrifying. And I just really love this movie. I think it's really just such a work of art. And it's so good that a horror film of this magnitude was able to win so many Oscars and really was an award darling. And I think that that is really a testament to what horror can be when the right horror project comes along. And this movie just really embodies that. Coming in at number 3 is going to be Army of Darkness. I finally got around to watching this movie about like 2.5 years ago. I remember this was like a lot of people's like favorite for a long time. And for me, I grew up on the original. I grew up on the sequel, Evil Dead 2. And I also really loved the Evil Dead remake. And so for me, I always knew that this movie was like more of kind of like the funny of Evil Dead 2 and not as much as the scary. And that always maybe turned me off from the idea of watching this movie. But I freaking love this movie. It's actually, in my opinion, better than Evil Dead 2. I don't know if I'd quite say it's better than the remake. I don't know. I'd have to really kind of look at them and compare them because they are two different movies. But this movie is so much fun. The fact that this movie is set in the Dark Ages is laughably awesome. The fact that you have Bruce Campbell probably at his best in this movie. And I love the fact that they balance his quirky funniness with the Deadite stuff in this movie. They do it so well. And I also really think that this movie also helped movies like Scream. It also helped movies like New Nightmare be able to have more of that comic relief. I personally think Sam Raimi is a genius. I love what he did with the original Evil Dead. And the fact that he didn't want to just go back to that well time and time again with Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness, but he decided, you know what, I'm going to do something completely off the rails, bonkers crazy, and just have fun with this premise and take it to its most absurd that it can be. And I love absurd horror in that way, because the way that I felt about Scream, I feel the exact same with this movie. Like sometimes we take things way too serious, and this movie was just like, no, screw all that. We're going to set Ash back, thousands of years, and he is just going to kill some Deadites, and it's going to be awesome. And it really is. It's freaking groovy, baby. Coming in at number 2 is going to be Misery. This movie is awesome. This is one of the best adapted Stephen King films that we've seen. Kathy Bates gives an unbelievable performance in this film. I mean, she is the thing that makes this movie stick. This crazed fan who loves this author so much and loves this book series that he created, that when she finds out he's not interested in doing anything more with that series, she kidnaps him and forces him to write a sequel in that franchise. And it is crazy because, it really is telling too, because it feels a lot like Stephen King talking about the way he feels sometimes and having to write his own stories. And I think that is just such a cool thing, is when you see like the author, and granted he didn't direct this film, but he's the author of the original source material, the book, like it just feels sometimes like they really want to tell the world, like, I love what I do, but here's one of the problems that I have with what I do. And that to me is just incredible. I always love having that little perspective and kind of that hidden messaging there. You feel like a prisoner in this film. You feel like James Caan. Like you can't leave at all. And it's so awesome that there's a movie like this because it's such a different kind of horror film. There's no monsters. There's no like, psychopath. Well, there is. Her name's Kathy Bates, but there's no psychopath going out and killing people, chopping them up into tiny pieces. This movie is very claustrophobic. It's very isolated. It's cold. It's all the things that you could really want in a film like this. It's just such a beautiful movie, and it's so freaking awesome. This movie really does, and it has some of the most grotesque scenes, man. The freaking the leg scene is torturous. I mean, it is so hard to sit through, and it's just incredible job by Rob Reiner and the entire team. I mean, this movie is just awesome, and it would be my number one if it wasn't for my number one film, which is Audition. This is a Japanese horror film that I just watched last night for the very first time. I had never seen this movie before. I had heard about it a little bit. I had heard certain tiny little things. I knew nothing about this movie going in. And I knew that it was a big deal because it was on a lot of the 90s horror lists that I would see. And so I was like, oh, I have to watch this movie. And this movie did the one thing that a lot of horror movies failed to do. And that is, this movie gave me nightmares last night. It gave me nightmares. And it was awesome. I'm going to briefly tell you what Audition is about because I really want you to watch this movie. So it is a Japanese horror film. It is about a man who is a widower, and after several years of being alone, finally decides that he is ready to get married again. But he's a shy guy, and he doesn't really feel like going back in the dating pool. It's very intimidating. And so with the help of one of his friends who is a professional auditioner for film and television, they set up a fake audition for a movie that doesn't exist, so that way this man can find a wife. And the movie sets it up like it's a romantic drama. Probably the first hour and a half of this movie is a romantic drama, but there's some subtleties with this woman that he ends up choosing that there's something off about her. You don't really know what is going on with her. She's very plain, but there's something to her that just feels off. From the moment you see her on screen, you get this really weird vibe about her. And the guy in this movie does something very sleazy by setting up this fake audition to get a wife, but he's not a bad guy. He just does a bad thing. And it's a very misogynistic thing. And it's not because he's misogynistic, but it's because that's kind of the ideal world that he lives in, where it's about powerful men. And so it's about social boundaries. And this woman has gone through a lot. And I don't want to tell you a lot about this movie because I want you to go in not knowing anything, because the end of this film left me speechless. And I can't believe what I saw. There is a scene in this movie that is incredibly scary. It is probably the best jump scare I've ever seen in my life. And it's very subtle, and it's very unexpected. And you just it leaves you wondering what that was. What is that thing? There's something there that like you're missing because you don't have the full context of the situation, the full gravity, and you're wondering, what is that thing? And then when you see that thing and what it actually is, it's very disturbing. And then this movie does something at the end of the film where it turns very violent very quick, and it turns very grotesque in a way, but not, it's like subtly grotesque. There's a lot more blood in other movies, and I'm not saying there's a lot of blood and violence in this movie, but the way that this movie goes about its business, the way that the film tells the story, leads you to be, down a road that you believe is going to happen with what the revelation is going to be, but then it strips that away and does something completely different. And it really sets up your expectations and then completely changes course. And it's awesome the way that it does it. It's very nice. And the film also has kind of been talked about a lot as being kind of dreamlike at the end. And I would agree with that, but I do think that there is a definitive end to this movie, and there is a definitive way that you can look at it, even though there is a lot of ambiguity. And then there's one thing about this movie that I want to say real quick for anybody who wants to watch it. There is a scene in this movie And after you watch the movie, you should definitely look it up, where they do something that will change the way that they shot it, did something that will forever be imprinted in my brain. And next time I watch this movie, I might skip the scene altogether because of how actually disturbing the making of that scene was for me, to where I don't even want to even think about it. And I can't get into detail. I really want to get into detail about this movie because it is masterful. This is a movie that is a masterpiece. It is one of the best horror films I've ever seen. I can't put it on my favorites list of all time because I have to watch it a second time, and I'm not ready to watch it for a second time. This movie really did impact me. I haven't stopped thinking about it since I watched it, and all day I've just thought about this movie. I mean, this is an incredible experience, and I think Audition is the best, easily the best horror film of the 90s, and you need to watch it. You really, 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 really need to watch it. But yeah, that is my list of the top 10 best horror films of the 90s. Let me know what you think about my list. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next week for a Friday the 13th video.